everyone, it's Bryony. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to a very long video today. I am finally getting around to filming my breastfeeding journey, a video that I've wanted to make pretty much since it started, and I started having some hiccups along the way, but I always wanted to get to a point where I felt like there was a good place to finish off with the video, and I only just reached that recently, as in like literally last week. So it's gonna be a long one. It's taken me pretty much all morning just to write the script for this video, just to make sure I didn't forget anything that happened, and like, it is a long one. So buckle up, get a tea, get a coffee, get a snack, whatever you want to sit down and enjoy my journey through breastfeeding. Let's start at the very beginning. So I've divided this video up into sections. We're going to start with my breastfeeding journey from birth, the first 6 weeks, 6 weeks to 6 months, and then 6 months to where I am right now with my son, who is currently 9 months old, so that I can kind of make sure I don't miss anything out. Those were kind of like the critical periods where things happened, and then I'll finally finish off with where I'm at now with my breastfeeding journey, and also what I wish I'd known, in case any of you out there are currently pregnant or going through your own breastfeeding struggles or thinking about having children in the future. I really wish I had known more about some of the stuff I'm going to talk about today. So be sure to stay along and watch if you can, to hopefully get some insight into things that can happen and also maybe how to prepare for that. So starting from the birth, I had always known that I wanted to try breastfeeding, but I very much had this idea in my mind of breastfeeding would either work or it wouldn't work, and if it worked, great, we'd breastfeed, and if it didn't work, I would formula feed, and there would be nothing wrong with that because I've fostered children before. Obviously all my foster babies were on formula milk, and so I was like, I'm going to be very logical about this. I'm going to go for breastfeeding if it works and formula feeding if it doesn't. What I wasn't prepared for was the fact that there is this whole grey zone when it comes to breastfeeding of like, kind of working. And that's where most of my story plays out. It plays out in this like kind of working sphere. So my son Oren was born by planned gentle C-section. During the surgery, after he was out, I was given skin to skin with him while they finished sewing me up. And right when they moved me from the operating bed onto my hospital bed, they asked me if I wanted to breast or bottle feed, and I said I would like to breastfeed. So the midwife explained that what they were going to do was prop me up on my side so that I could breastfeed as soon as I got into recovery. So that's what they did. They propped me up with my left side higher than my right, I remember, and Oren was placed kind of in my arms here. I was wheeled out straight into recovery, and within 5 minutes of being in there, one of the nurses came in and said, would you like to breastfeed? And I said yes, and because I was still very numb, she helped me position Oren on my right breast. And I remember she asked me if she could try and get some colostrum to come out, which basically involves just like squeezing a nipple. And so she did that, and she did, and it came very quickly, and she said, oh, that's a really good sign. And Oren latched on straight away, and he had a really good latch, and he fed, I think, that first time for about an hour. Like, he had a really long latch that time, I do remember. It's probably the longest feed he's ever had, was that first one. So right from the beginning, everything went really well, which was great. Bit later on in the day, he was a bit more sleepy and he wasn't really wanting to feed. If I could get him on the boob, he wasn't really sucking or anything. So at that point, I did have to express my colostrum into these little syringes throughout the night. And I think I got around 0.5 mil, which was enough for him to have a little bit throughout the night until the next morning, where he perked up a bit and was happy to feed from me again. The second night in hospital, however, I made my first mistake because I ended up giving Oren a dummy. Partly because the second night was my first night with him on my own. The first night my mum had stayed, and so she was able to hand him to me whenever he needed feeding. The second night I still couldn't really move around that much because my anaesthetic lasted quite a while. So it was tricky getting him in and out of the cot. So I kind of left him between my legs on the bed and just made sure it was all clear around him. And when he needed to feed, I'd feed him, I'd change him there. But also after he'd had a feed, he was still a bit grizzly, and so I wanted to get some sleep, and I thought I'll try a dummy with him. And sure enough, he took it and he slept really well for a bit, and that gave me a chance to sleep, which was great. However, the next time he needed a feed, he could not latch onto my breast. Like, I tried both of them, and I tried to shape my nipple for him, and he just kept going on and coming off. He wouldn't suckle, and he was getting really distressed because he was obviously quite hungry, but he wouldn't latch on, and it was really quite a stressful time. Thankfully, however, while I had done my antenatal class, there was a mum there who had previously already had 3 children, and they were significantly older, which is why she'd come to make some new mum friends. And she was sharing about the fact that she'd only managed to get through breastfeeding by having nipple shields, and they were like her saviour in the early weeks. And so I had been out and bought some before going to hospital, and I had brought them with me. So when Oren wouldn't latch on, I thought, let me try with a nipple shield because it's a bit more similarly shaped to the mam dummy that I've been giving him. And thank the Lord, he latched on with that. So I was so grateful that I had brought those nipple shields with me. After that one time where he wouldn't latch without the nipple shield, he did then latch on my breast no problem the next time. I wasn't 100% sure whether or not it was a dummy or just pure bad luck or whatever had happened. So I tried again, I think later in the day or maybe the next day, giving him the dummy and putting him on the breast again, and he had the same issue. So it definitely was the dummy that caused that. But again, luckily, because by this point I figured out that I could get him to latch with the nipple shield if I needed to, it wasn't the end of the world. And I think he did grow out of that after about the first week. But I did try and limit the dummy after that because I wanted him to be latching onto me as much as possible. On day 3, my milk came in. I remember waking up, going to the toilet, and then realising that my nightie was kind of like soaked on one side, and I was like, oh, that'll be my milk. So up until this point, I basically had just been, I hadn't had a bra on or anything, I just had a nightie with like some buttons down the front that I would unbutton and then pull to one side depending on which breast he wanted to feed on. But at this point I had to start putting on bras so I could stick the breast pads in them to catch any leaking that was happening. And on day 3 we were still in the hospital as well. We were in the hospital for 3 nights, 4 days. Day 3 they weighed him and he had lost 7% of his birth weight. Anything under 10% is considered normal, so again he passed that with flying colours and we were doing great. The midwives did take a look at him while he was feeding and he seemed to be doing good. His latch seemed to be good. I had done a little bit of research before I'd had him, so I had some idea of what I needed to do when it came to breastfeeding, and from what I could tell he seemed to be feeding fine. He seemed to be coming, latching onto the breast well, he seemed to be feeding well, and so we were discharged from hospital on day 4 with flying colours and went home to continue recovering there. So now we get to the first 6 weeks. So after we were discharged from hospital, the next day the midwives came to visit us and they weighed him, so he was 5 days old at this point, and at this time he had gained a little bit of weight. He hadn't gained a lot of weight, but he had gained a bit of weight back since they'd weighed him on day 3, and I thought, this is great, like he's feeding well, he's feeding regularly, he's pretty contented as a baby, he's not super sleepy, he's pretty alert and he's happy to feed, and everything seemed to be going really well. He did at this point have a slightly higher jaundice reading. Jaundice is really common with babies, and I had been jaundiced myself as a baby, so I knew there was a pretty good chance that he would be too. It was slightly higher than normal, but it wasn't over the threshold, so the midwife called in the paediatrician or somebody who was on call, and they said they just wanted someone to come out tomorrow and check him. So that's what happened. On day 6, someone came to do a reading. That one was slightly higher, but again, it was only just over the threshold. So we were sent off to hospital to check up on that. But he wasn't sleepy, he wasn't lethargic, he was very happy to feed, and so they were quite happy with him. We were literally, I think, went in the hospital, they took one look at him, took a reading, and they said, well, our reading's under the threshold, so you can go now. So I was actually quite happy to go straight back home. Day 8, however, is when things start to really go downhill. So this is my first checkup with the midwife where I actually go to the hospital to have it done. And I go in, he's been doing great, he's had wet and dirty nappies, everything's brilliant. Put him on the scale and I realised he hasn't gained any weight. In fact, if anything, he's lost, I think, 10 grams since the last time they weighed him on day 5. And my heart just sinks because at that point I feel like something's not working. The midwife there was really great, however. They were actually a little bit more worried about his jaundice reading because it was still kind of on the higher side again. So we were sent back across to the other part of the hospital where we'd been on day 6. This time they did a blood test, and the nurse who was there, oh my goodness, she was so nice. She put me straight in my own little cubicle. She brought me tea, brought me biscuits because I was breastfeeding, and then she was really encouraging. She was like, his blood, when they do the heel prick, it came out really easily. She was like, that's a great sign that he's really hydrated, and that's something we look for, and he's clearly alert and he's feeding well, and so it was all good signs. They tested him, he was fine, so we were sent home again. And the midwife, before we'd actually been sent over to that part of the hospital, had just said when it came to feeding, make sure you're putting him on both breasts, maybe even consider using a hacker if you've got one to catch the letdown, because you can always like top him up a bit with that, and just keep doing what you're doing. But I, at this point, had started to feel that kind of sense of, I'm failing at this. It honestly is such a horrible feeling. And I don't know if it was because of that or if I did genuinely have a 24-hour bug, but my stomach was upset the rest of that evening and the next day too. And so my appetite was killed, didn't really want to eat or drink. And that definitely affected my milk supply, because that night was the only night that Oren ever cluster fed. And literally it was like every hour and I could barely put him down. And I could just feel like my milk was drying up basically. So day 10, the midwives come out to weigh him again. And once again, he has gained no weight. So at this point, he has not gained any weight at all since he was 5 days old. This time, the midwife, who happened to be my midwife who actually took care of me throughout my later pregnancy, has a gentle conversation with me about the fact that we really do need to start thinking about topping him up now. And she gives me a few options for how to do that. She says if you want to top him up with expressed breast milk, I'd recommend getting an electric pump and doing that as much as you can throughout the day after he's fed, to try and encourage to kind of fully drain the breast and encourage your breasts to make more milk. But she was also honest about how that is a lot of work and that you probably might want to consider topping him up with formula now, which I did appreciate how she did that, because I didn't have enough express milk at that time to be able to top him up with it. I hadn't actually, I think, been pumping at all by this point. I sent my mum out to go and buy a breast pump after she'd left, and I started pumping, but I did have to start topping him up with formula initially. And then day 12, he is weighed again, and at this point he has gained weight because we've started topping him up. So that's a bit of a relief that he is gaining weight now, but I still feel a bit sad about the fact that I've had to introduce some formula to him. He hasn't got back to his birth weight. He's weighed again on day 14, 2 days later, and he's gained more weight then, not quite as much as he did the first time, but he probably had a bit of catching up to do at that point. He's weighed again and he's gained more weight, not quite a birth weight yet. And I think he hit his birth weight again when he was around 2.5 weeks old. At around 2 weeks, I decide that I'd like to see a lactation consultant. So I book a virtual consultation with one because it was cheaper than having them come to see me in person. And I just kind of wanted to get a sense of if I felt they'd be useful or not. She was able to look through like the webcam at Oren's latch and how he was feeding, and she also suggested some other like natural breastfeeding positions for me to try, and they were really helpful. And she basically encouraged me to just keep putting him to the breast, and he should continue to do well with that and keep the top-ups going as long as I needed to. Now, throughout this period, I continued to pump milk as often as I could after he'd fed, and also I tried to get a bit more milk in the gaps between when he had his feed. So if he went down for a nap, I'd try and wait half an hour and then pump just one breast so that the other one would stay full, but kind of continue my breast, encouraging my breasts to keep like making more milk. And it did work. Like my breast milk production definitely did increase throughout this time, which was really encouraging. At 3 weeks old, I took him to see a cranial osteopath who was able to kind of do some gentle adjustments on him, but also she was trained to check for something called tongue tie. Now, I didn't think Oren had a tongue tie because he had a very comfortable latch. He seemed to be getting a strong suckle, and from the way it looked, he seemed to be feeding well too. But I just wanted to double check to make sure, and the cranial osteopath had a feel around, and she said his latch felt good and it didn't look like he had a tongue tie from what she could see. And so that was reassuring to me as well, that that wasn't one of the issues why my milk was maybe a bit on the lower side. So I continued to pump until my breast milk supply increased, and I gradually reduced the amount of top-ups he was having. He ended up from about 3 weeks on being exclusively topped up with breast milk, and then from 4 weeks on I stopped the topping up altogether and he just went to being breastfed. By around 6 weeks, this is when breastfeeding became much more comfortable for me. The initial kind of discomfort or stinging sensation when you first put them on because your nipples aren't used to being sucked on all the time, that really started to wane. I remember by 6 weeks it got much easier. Breastfeeding was never painful for me. It was just that kind of like, ooh, initial stinging of like something wet chewing on this part of your skin that's been sucked on a lot recently. But by 6 weeks, your nipples toughen up a little bit, and that was no longer the case. I never had cracked or bleeding nipples. I did use the silver nipple cups as well. They were really good. And I had the Lancino cream as well. All of that together just really helped to keep things in good condition. And like I said, I don't think he had a problem with his latch, so that probably helped too. So by 6 weeks, I felt much more comfortable. He seemed to be feeding regularly. He was doing plenty of wet and dirty nappies. So I was feeling much more confident about breastfeeding at this point, and really hoped that we'd put the tricky times behind us. Oh boy, how wrong I was. So now we get to the 6 weeks to 6 months section of the video. So my GP does all the mum and baby wellness checks at 8 weeks. So at 8 weeks, I went and had my first checkup since I had him with the doctor, and also he was checked over by the doctor too. It's also when he had his first jabs. Quite a lot of stuff happened around 8 weeks. But they also chose to weigh him, and at this point, He had gained weight, but he had dropped a centile. So he was born on like the 25th. And then by the time he got his weight back, I think he was on the 9th. And at this appointment, they weighed him and he was on the 2nd. If you're not familiar with the centile chart, it's basically a chart that is designed by the World Health Organization. It's based off of breastfed babies. So one of the things you might hear is that you can ignore the charts because they're based off formula-fed babies. That's not the case in the UK. They are based off of breastfed babies. And it's basically how they plot their weight to make sure everything's going okay. Because if babies start dropping centiles, that can be an indication that something's wrong. So at this point, Oren had dropped to the 2nd centile, and the doctor said that she wasn't too worried as long as he stayed along that centile chart, then that would be absolutely fine. That might just be where he was going to sit at. But again, at this point, I'm starting to feel that kind of churning in my stomach again of, oh, things still aren't quite right here. There's still more going on. And she said that they would check him again at the 12-week jabs that he was having. So between 8 weeks and 12 weeks, I continue to exclusively breastfeed him. I feel a bit anxious about it, but I think at 10 weeks, I might have even bought like my own set of baby scales to see if he was gaining weight. And I think I put him on it once and he had. And so I felt a bit more confident, but I was also a bit worried about what was going to happen at this 12-week checkup and whether they were going to try and push me to formula feed him at that point. So we go to his 12-week jab appointment. I see the nurse, she does his jabs and she doesn't weigh him. And I don't make any mention of it because at this point, I'm ecstatic that she's taken a look at him. She doesn't think he's super skinny enough to be like, oh my gosh, I must weigh this child. And she sends us on a happy way and off we go. And I leave this appointment feeling elated. I'm like, we haven't had to be weighed. We're just going on with things. Everything's going okay. La-di-da, everything's wonderful. However, that initial elation wears off pretty quick. And the next week, he is 13 weeks and we happen to be in France for a small family holiday. And while I'm out there, I just can't get out of my head the fact that there is now nobody watching him with regards to his weight. And even though he's doing plenty of wet and dirty nappies and seems to be ticking off a lot of the kind of World Health Organization signs that breastfeeding's working kind of chart, there's just a sense for me that something's not quite right, and I just really want somebody to weigh him again and be keeping an eye on him. So at this point, I decide to reach out to my health visitor who had previously come. In the UK, they come at 2 and 6 weeks. And she had last time said to me, because I'd had mental health problems in my pregnancy, that she'd be happy to see me a bit more often if I wanted to. So I reached out to, I didn't have her number particularly, but I reached out to the health visiting service and asked them if they could get her to ring me so she could come and see me and do a weight check for him. So the first call back I actually missed from them, and they left a message essentially saying, we'd actually like you to just come to one of our weigh-ins. But I was still having therapy at this point, and the therapy clashed with that drop-in session for the weigh-in, so I knew I couldn't make that. I think I might have left this in the voicemail message or something, because I remember being quite cross that they'd ignored this. So I sent them an email and was like, I can't make this because I have a perinatal mental health appointments on this day every week. Please could you ask this particular health visitor to get in touch with me? She knows me, she will come out and see me. And anyway, long story short, she gave me a call back and said, would you like me to come out tomorrow? This was the day we were travelling back from France. And I was like, yes, please. While we were on the ferry coming back from France, I also called La Lèche League because another friend of mine who'd also been having trouble with breastfeeding had said she'd had a really good chat with someone from there. So I rang them, I think I'd left a message actually the day before, but they rang me back while I was on the boat. Had a conversation with them and she was like, yeah, it does sound like you're maybe not producing quite enough milk, so you might want to consider, you know, eating this and, you know, pumping more. But this was the first time I also heard someone mention domperidone, which I'll get onto a bit later in the video. The next day, the health visitor comes round, she weighs him. He is a little bit below the 2nd centile at this point, but he hasn't massively dropped off, so I do feel a bit of relief about that. But I'm still a bit concerned that he's sort of hovering around the lower end. So she suggests that she should come back in 2 weeks' time and weigh him again, which I agree with. I think at this point I also call my GP and try to get a prescription for domperidone, but they say that they won't prescribe it. Domperidone is a drug that is not actually designed for breastfeeding mothers. It's designed as like an anti-reflux, an antiemetic drug, but it has a side effect of making you produce more milk. So I was really keen to try it, but my GP practice personally didn't agree with prescribing it, so I wasn't able to get a prescription at that point. So at 15 weeks, the health visitor comes back, she weighs him again, and again, he's still kind of hovering in between the 2nd and the 0.4th centile, hasn't dropped off massively. And so he's continually kind of following a trend. And so she says, how about I come back in 4 weeks' time next time? And I thought, that seems fair. Maybe I'm just being a bit neurotic about this. He's actually okay. He's had 2 weighs now where he's been okay. So let's do 4 weeks next time. Turned out to be a big mistake though. At 15 weeks, my period came back, and although it wasn't as painful as it had previously been before I had a baby, it was still very heavy and it was still a bit painful, and I decided I cannot be bothered to be dealing with this at the moment while I've got a young baby as well, so I'm going to go back on my pill. The pill that I was previously on is a pill called desogestrel. It is a progesterone only pill, and I checked online that it was fine to take with breastfeeding, and it said yes, and so I decided to take the risk of taking it, because even though it is a progesterone only pill, there is still a small chance, a small percentage of women who experience their breast milk production going down even on the progesterone only pill. So I decided that to me the risk is worth it because I don't want my period, so I decided to start taking this pill again. Then at 16 weeks, I go to an NCT breastfeeding morning drop-in because I just want to have someone see me in person breastfeeding Oren and just double check that I've got his latch right, that I'm doing everything okay, see what they think about the weight stuff as well. I just wanted some extra reassurance. So I went and saw them, and they were a little bit baffled too, because they looked at him, they looked at his latch, they looked at how he was feeding, how he looked, and they were like, yeah, he looks really good, he looks healthy, he's got a good latch. Probably the best thing you can do is just try and increase his breastfeed, just try and get an extra breastfeed in each day, because he was gaining weight at this point, but he just never quite gained enough to stay on a centre line. If he needed to gain, say, 120 grams, he'd gain 100. So she was very encouraging about, like, just try and put him to the breast more often. It's only really one extra feed's worth that should get him there. And so I was following that advice and feeding him. Well, I was already feeding him on demand and trying to do both breasts, and there's so much that's involved as well. Throughout the early days where I was like trying to pump as well to increase my supply, I had all sorts of breastfeeding contraptions. I'll need to do a video specifically just on these, I think. But I would like have a collector in one breast while I fed on one side, and then when I switched to the other, I'd switch it to a hacker so that it would like draw out more milk, and then I'd pump afterwards. And it was just this whole like fiasco of trying to work out what to do. It was really complex. I can't even remember exactly what I did, but I remember I had this whole system for it. But by this point I was hoping to avoid that, so I was just trying to basically feed him as much as possible. And then at around 19 or 20 weeks, at this point I start losing track of him in age terms of weeks and move on to months, but at this point the health visitor comes back 4 weeks later to weigh him, and this is where all the problems start, because he has gained weight but he hasn't gained very much, and in fact it's so little that it basically makes him plummet off the graph entirely at this point. And this is the moment where I say to the health visitor, do you think I should call the GP now? And she'd said, I think you should. So she came on a Thursday. That Thursday I went through the GP kind of like online triage system and said what the symptoms were and that I needed to see a doctor, and they sent me an appointment for Monday the following week. So between Thursday and Monday I decided to start topping him up with some expressed breast milk. I'm pumping, I think, again every evening at this point, although during the time where I started taking the pill and the 4 weeks before the health visitor came, Oren also went through his 4-month regression, which meant he was waking up more often, so I'd stopped pumping, and I think I would have noticed my milk supply dropping gradually if I had continued pumping in the evenings, probably because of the pill, although it's all hypothetical at this point. We'll never really know what happened, but I think it was the pill that reduced my milk supply around this time. I think I'm still able to pump 60 to 80 ml at this point though, and so he's having a 60 to 80 ml top-up bottle each day, and then 4 days later on Monday we go to the GP and she weighs him again, and at this appointment he's actually lost weight since he was weighed on Thursday. So she then decides that he needs to be referred to the paediatrician, and they send off the referral that same day. So I saw her on a Monday. The next Monday I get a phone call from the hospital saying, could I speak to a dietitian that afternoon on the phone? And I obviously said yes. And I spoke to the dietitian and went through all the things that have been happening, and she says, I think we really need to consider topping him up with some high calorie formula at this point. And I feel really sad about this because right up until this time he's been exclusively breastfed. Even that week between the doctor and the dietitian calling me, I'm topping him up with more express bottles of milk to try and like increase the amount of milk that's getting into him to see if he can start gaining weight better. But I agree with her that I think he does need to start trying something else at this point. And I'm sad that it's the end of my exclusive breastfeeding journey, and it's hard to like put into words how emotional that is. Like, if you've not had made the choice, if it's not been a choice for you, if you've had to do it through necessity rather than consciously deciding we're going to combi feed, it's very difficult to go there. But I did agree with her that he needed something else at this point. And then either the next day or the day after that, the health visitor came back again to weigh him 2 weeks after the last time she'd weighed him, and the first time we had an indication that something wasn't quite right. And at this appointment, he's lost even more weight since we saw the GP. So at that point, my brain fully switches over from feeling quite sad about needing to have the formula to being like, actually, we need this formula ASAP. Because the formula they want to put him on is quite special, it requires the dietitian to send a referral to the GP, who then has to write the prescription and send it to the pharmacy. I then have to call the pharmacy and ask them to order it in, because it's not one that they hold in stock, and they won't automatically order it in until I ask them to, because it takes up a lot of room. And then they order it in and it comes in the next day. So there's this whole fiasco process of getting this milk. But I think I am able to get hold of it by the Friday, and we start topping him up with that. So around 10 days after he started taking that formula, the health visitor weighs him again, and this time he has gained some weight back, thankfully, but it's not quite as much as the dietitian had hoped. And by the way, this dietitian has been amazing. We still see her. She's so responsive to any emails I have. So every 2 weeks I will email her his weight gain, and she'll be like, yeah, that's good. And if I had any questions about his eating, she would also respond to that too. So she comes back and says, it's great that he's gained some weight, but I really want him to gain some more. So could you please up the dose to this amount? So we do. And 2 weeks later, he's weighed again, and he's gained more weight at this point, thankfully. Now, during this time as well, where his weight really starts to plummet, I make the decision that I'm going to go and see a private lactation consultant who's also a qualified doctor who is able to prescribe me domperidone, because I've exhausted all the other ways to get it. I was a bit frustrated because one of my friends was able to get a prescription for domperidone from her GP, but my GP practice doesn't do that, and it wasn't worth trying to switch GPs just for the sake of this. So I decide that I'm going to invest some money to have a private consultation with this lactation consultant who's a qualified doctor. And I do speak to her, go through all his symptoms and everything that's been happening, etc. And she agrees with me that she thinks it is a low milk supply problem. And so she does give me the prescription for domperidone, and I start taking this. And thank the Lord, it works. I notice within 3 days an increase in my milk supply. From when I pump, it's significantly increasing again, which is such a relief. So that, combined with the formula, starts to have an effect. And at this point, he turns 6 months. So now we are at the 6 month to 9 month section. So when babies turn 6 months, this is where we start to wean them. We don't necessarily wean them off breast milk, we just start introducing solids. I should probably say introducing solids, it's more accurate. But something else happens at this stage as well, which is that we had initially had a referral to the paediatrician, which was for an appointment in October. At this point in time where he's just turned 6 months, it's August. And I get a phone call from them literally the same day I get the letter saying he's got an appointment in October, saying, actually, could you please come and see the paediatrician next week? And I'm really pleased with that, because I felt like October was a bit too long to leave it with him potentially having something else going on, and they obviously want to check him over because of the weight gain issues. Now, up until Oren was about 5 months, the only thing he really displayed was low weight gain. However, between 5 months and 6 months, there were some other signs and symptoms showing up. I'm not going to talk about what those things are. There are a few things I'm happy to mention on here. I've talked about the weight because that's specifically linked to my milk supply. I talked about the jaundice because that's very common, and I'm also about to talk about allergies. And the only reason I'm talking about that is because by its very nature, it's something I have to constantly disclose anyway. But the kind of symptoms and other things around that, I'm not going to share on here, so please don't ask me about them. I'm not going to make them public. But I wanted to share as much as I could in case anyone else is kind of in a similar boat and is struggling to figure out what's going on. So I'm juggling a hard line here of wanting to keep, specific medical information private for my son, but also things that are quite generic and actually really common things that babies experience. Those are the things that I'm sort of sharing on here. So we had this appointment with the paediatrician the next week, and as it so happens, literally on the morning we go to see the paediatrician, something happens which makes me really think, I think something else is going on here. And thankfully we had the paediatrician that afternoon, so I go to see him and I kind of go through everything that's been going on and explain to him what's happened that morning, and he says, I think it sounds like Oren might potentially have a cow's milk protein allergy. So basically, if they suspect a child has this allergy, all they will tell you to do is cut out anything that contains dairy or soy from their diet, and if you're breastfeeding, from yours as well. So that's what I was recommended to do. And this was not long after he had turned 6 months. So I had already started introducing solids to him, and he had had 1 or 2 things with dairy in, but fortunately not many. So at this point we were able to cut it out from both of our diets. Annoyingly, it was the day before I went on a cruise ship, so it did significantly limit my food choices while I was out on that cruise ship. But I was so wanting to try and figure out what was going on, and also kind of gave me a glimmer of hope in some way, because CMPA is an allergy that many children grow out of, but it could also potentially explain why he'd had issues gaining weight, because that is one of the symptoms of cow's milk protein allergy. And it kind of made me feel like maybe it wasn't me that was causing the problem. Even though I do think I had a slightly lower milk supply, it possibly could have been enough if I'd cut dairy out, and in hindsight I kind of wish I'd tried doing that sooner, because although they don't do any tests or anything when they think that they've got CMPA, they just say cut it out for 6 weeks and see what happens. But hindsight is always 20/20, isn't it? So at this point he also gets switched onto a new formula which is suitable for babies with cow's milk protein allergy. It's not a high calorie one though, and 2 weeks later he's weighed again. I've started cutting it, I've cut out my diet, he's on this new formula, but he's barely gained any weight again. So we get switched back to the old type of formula, but this type is a high calorie one that is sensitive to cow's milk protein allergy. And from then on, he seems to do really well. So at this point, he is finally consistently gaining good amounts of weight, and that is the point where we're at now. So with a combination of me cutting out dairy and soy from my diet, and obviously from his too, plus this sensitive formula for him, and he's increasingly eating more solids now, he's now at a point where he is consistently gaining weight, which is such a relief. And literally as of last week, he is finally back on the centile chart. Hallelujah. It took months to get there, but we finally did it. So where are we now? Well, as of today, he is happily combination fed. He is mostly breastfed throughout the day, but he has 2 high calorie top-ups, which I give him after each of his naps. I found a routine that works well for us, and it's just what we're doing. Plus with his eating, he seems to be gaining weight well, and I honestly have no desire to try and get him back to being exclusively breastfed at this point in time. The combination of breast milk and formula that he's on seems to be working for him, and he's thriving and happy and healthy, and that's ultimately all that I want for him. I initially really felt the loss of not being able to make the decision to combination feed, but it was absolutely necessary for him to do that, and I kind of am annoyed at myself that I left it as long as I did. If I'm being truthful, what I did was I tried to find resources and people online who were really pro breastfeeding, and just used their kind of what they were saying as ways to excuse myself of, actually no, he's doing fine, like wet and dirty nappies, he's great, like we don't need to introduce anything else, don't need to worry about this, they're too focused on formula or medical intervention and blah blah blah, etc etc. But really I think deep down I knew that something wasn't right, and I am quite mad at myself that I left it as long as I did, because I feel like if maybe I'd started introducing some top-ups sooner, or if maybe I'd tried going dairy-free sooner, he wouldn't have ever got to the point where he completely dropped off the chart and had to take months to get back onto it. So I definitely do feel a sense of guilt about that too. I am also still taking domperidone, although I have been able to reduce the dose I'm taking daily now to just 2 or 3 pills a day as opposed to 9 that you have to take at the beginning, and that's keeping my milk supply at a level which is okay. I did try to wean off it entirely, and my milk completely plummeted, like dropped through the floor. It went even worse than it had been before, so I definitely can't breastfeed without it now, which is a little bit annoying, but the doctor who prescribed it for me was really lovely, and she was able to do me a repeat prescription without me having an appointment, and she gave me a higher amount as well. So I am now sorted for domperidone to keep me breastfeeding until he is 1. And that is my current goal, is to continue breastfeeding him in some capacity. I'm not determined to get him exclusively breastfed again, but I do want to continue breastfeeding him to some extent until he is 1 year old. At 1, because I am really missing like the dairy and the soy from my diet, I'm going to try introducing them back into my diet and seeing if he reacts to that and how he does. If he's okay with it, great, I will continue breastfeeding him on longer than that. But if he does react to it, then that is the point where I will probably end my breastfeeding journey and keep him on the cow's milk protein free diet for as long as he needs it. But, you know, I mean, I might change my opinion when it comes to the time and decide I want to do it a bit longer or not. But as of right now, that is currently my plan. So ultimately, what do I wish I knew before starting my breastfeeding journey? The one thing I really wish I had known before starting this is just how emotional breastfeeding can be. I did not expect the emotional attachment I had to it. When things were going wrong, I thought I would be very logical about it and be like, okay, it's not working, we'll just introduce some top-ups and see how it is. But oh my goodness, like it was just, it felt like I had failed. I felt like I was not doing good as a mother. Like the emotional attachment I had to this was so strong, and I'd completely underestimated that. I also wish that I'd been a bit more prepared for the fact that things sometimes don't work out perfectly. And as I said at the very beginning of this video, that there's this real grey zone when it comes to breastfeeding of things just kind of working but not really working, and that you might not be able to fully breastfeed, but you might not need to fully formula feed either. There is a kind of comfortable middle zone that you may be able to find. And I also wish that I'd known getting professional help sooner was really important, and that could have helped out ultimately. But yeah, there you go. That is my whole breastfeeding journey up till now when my son is 9 months old. Thank you so much if you did stick around for the whole thing. I know it was a lot, but I really wanted to share it because I felt like some of you might relate to this journey, or some of you might be starting your journey, and perhaps hearing someone else who went down a similar path could be reassuring to you and not make you feel so alone if you're in that place. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, guys. Do please subscribe, and a big thank you to my channel Superstar members as well, who enable me to make more content that I want rather than just stuff that the algorithm likes. If you want to consider joining, maybe click the join button or the link in the description down below and see what benefits you get. Thank you for watching, everyone. Do please subscribe, and I will see you next Friday. Bye everyone, have a great day.